in the pale quiet of a winter morning in 13th century Italy, before the bells had fully settled into the valleys, and before the roads began to stir with carts, hooves, and the low speech of servants, there was already a world of stone, parchment, incense, and disciplined thought waiting to receive one of its most enduring minds. In the hills of the kingdom of Sicily, where fortresses clung to rock and monasteries stood like patient witnesses above vineyards and fields, a child was born into a society that believed heaven and earth were joined by an invisible but ordered chain. It was an age that still moved at the pace of prayer and season, yet it was also an age of sharp argument, new translations, rising universities, and renewed confidence in the power of the human intellect. Thomas Aquinas entered that world not as a solitary genius appearing from nowhere, but as a son of a noble family, a child shaped by political unrest, monastic ritual, and the deep structure of medieval Christian life. Around him lay a landscape dense with authority. Emperors and popes contested the boundaries of power. Monasteries preserved old learning, while cities drew students into newer forms of debate. Ancient Greek philosophy, carried through Arabic and Latin traditions, had begun to circulate more widely in Europe, and with it came questions that touched almost every field of thought. What could reason know on its own? What required revelation? How should the soul, the body, the law, the state, and God be understood in relation to one another? He would grow into a large, quiet man, whose manner seemed so reserved that others sometimes mistook silence for slowness. Yet beneath that still exterior worked an intellect of extraordinary steadiness and range, one capable of gathering scripture, philosophy, theology, logic, law, and observation into a grand architecture of thought that has outlived kingdoms, universities, and entire eras of dispute. He did not seek novelty for its own sake. He sought clarity, proportion, and truth. In the candlelit rooms where he taught and dictated, amid the rustle of robes and the scratch of quills, he spent his life asking not only what human beings believe, but how they know, why they act, and toward what end all things move. His story unfolds slowly, through castles and cloisters, through lecture halls in Paris and Cologne, through the debates of mendicant friars and the rediscovery of Aristotle, through triumph, suspicion, exhaustion, and a silence at the end more eloquent than argument. It is a journey through one life and through the wider medieval world that gave it form. Thomas was born around 1224 or 1225, most likely at Roccasecca, a fortress associated with his family near the town of Aquino between Rome and Naples. The region belonged to the Kingdom of Sicily, though the name can mislead the modern ear, for this kingdom encompassed much of southern Italy as well as the island itself. It was a land of political complexity and cultural overlap, touched by Latin Christianity, Norman legacy, imperial ambition, and the long afterglow of contact with Greek and Arab intellectual traditions. In such a place, power was rarely simple. The papacy watched the empire with suspicion. Noble families shifted their loyalties carefully. Monasteries stood not far from military roads. His father, Landulf of Aquino, belonged to the lesser nobility, and his mother, Theodora, came from a family of high standing. Thomas entered a household that valued lineage, prestige, and the careful placement of sons into roles that could secure the future of the family. In a great house of that kind, a child did not belong entirely to himself. He existed within the expectations of blood and inheritance. Some sons would take up arms, some would manage estates, and some would be placed in the church, where ecclesiastical office might deepen the reach of noble influence. The physical world of his childhood would have impressed itself on him before language could capture it. The fortress at Roccasecca overlooked a stern and beautiful terrain of limestone heights, cultivated slopes and roads that carried pilgrims, merchants, messengers, and soldiers. The air in summer could be hot and dusty. In colder months, the stone interiors would have held a long chill. He would have known the sounds of kitchens, stables, watch posts, and chapel bells. He would have seen armed retainers, clerics, servants, and relatives moving through the rhythms of a noble household. Medieval childhood was not sentimental in the modern sense, but it was attentive to formation. The young learned by imitation, repetition, and discipline. One institution loomed especially large over the early course of his life: the great Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino. Founded centuries earlier by Saint Benedict himself, the monastery stood as one of the most venerable religious houses in Latin Christendom. It was not merely a place of prayer, it was a centre of learning, prestige, and political significance. For a noble family in the region, placement there could be both spiritually honourable and socially advantageous. As a small boy, Thomas was sent to Monte Cassino, likely as an oblate or a pupil, and in that move, the direction of his early education began to take shape. The abbey offered a world very different from the turbulence of noble estates. Within its walls, time was measured by the liturgy, by psalms sung in choir, by reading, copying, and the ordered repetition of monastic life. The architecture itself instructed the senses. Thick walls held cool shadows, candles flickered against stone, the smell of wax, vellum, damp cloth, and incense mingled in corridors and chapels. Monks moved with the seriousness of men whose lives had been bound to common prayer. For a child of intelligence and quiet disposition, such an atmosphere may well have left deep impressions. At Monte Cassino, he would have encountered the first formal elements of the education that medieval Latin culture reserved for the promising young: grammar, basic logic, liturgical language, scripture, and the habits of attentive reading. Latin was not merely a subject, it was the vessel of worship, scholarship, law, and memory. To be formed in Latin was to enter the intellectual bloodstream of the age. Here, too, he would have seen learning presented not as entertainment or ornament, but as service to truth and to God. Yet the peace of Monte Cassino existed within a wider political instability. During Thomas's youth, conflict between the papacy and Emperor Frederick II cast a long shadow across Italy. Monte Cassino itself was not immune. Armies moved through the region. Allegiances could prove dangerous. Monasteries, despite their sacred character, were caught in the struggles of princes and prelates. For a family such as the Aquinas, political caution was essential. The placement of sons in powerful institutions could no longer be assumed to be secure. Somewhere in these early years, the boy's path shifted again. Rather than remaining on a straightforward route toward monastic office at Monte Cassino, he was eventually sent to Naples, where a new kind of educational world awaited him. The move itself reflected the changing intellectual climate of Europe. Older monastic schools still mattered deeply, but the rise of urban schools and universities was reshaping the transmission of knowledge. Naples, founded as a university city by Frederick II, offered exposure to the livelier, more disputatious culture of higher learning. The Naples into which Thomas came was unlike the enclosed dignity of Monte Cassino. It was a city of streets, markets, legal business, and varied peoples. Sailors, clerks, officials, mendicant preachers, and students crossed one another in public space. In the schools there, classical texts, legal reasoning, and philosophical questions were addressed with a new directness. Aristotle's works, increasingly available in translation, were beginning to stir the European mind. Alongside Scripture and the Church Fathers stood a formidable body of pagan philosophy, asking disciplined questions about nature, motion, cause, ethics, and being itself. For a youth already trained in religious learning, this broader intellectual world may have felt not like a contradiction, but but like an expansion. What had begun in the choir stalls and schoolrooms of Monte Cassino now widened into inquiry about the structure of creation and the powers of reason. Thomas was still young, but the forces shaping him had become visible. Noble birth gave him entry into educated life. Monastic formation gave him patience and seriousness. The school culture of Naples opened his mind to argument and breadth. There was also, in Naples, a presence that would alter the course of his life even more decisively than books. The recently founded Order of Preachers, commonly called the Dominicans, had established itself there. Unlike older monastic communities tied to place and stability, the friars were mobile, urban, and intellectually engaged. They embraced poverty, preaching, and study. Their black and white habits became familiar in university towns, where they sought not withdrawal from the world, but a disciplined encounter with it. For some families, especially noble ones, this new style of religious life seemed unsettling. It lacked the settled prestige of ancient abbeys. It could look like a surrender of rank and inheritance. Thomas, however, was drawn to it. The attraction was not merely emotional or rebellious. The Dominicans joined contemplation to teaching, discipline to argument, prayer to public intellectual labor. In them he may have recognized a vocation that matched the deepest lines already being drawn in him. He was not made for the battlefield of his ancestors, and perhaps not even for the enclosed continuity of Benedictine leadership. He was made for study in the service of preaching, for thought ordered toward truth, for a life both rigorous and apostolic. The world of his childhood had prepared him in ways no one could fully foresee. The silence of monasteries, the ambitions of noble households, the political roughness of southern Italy, the ordered texture of liturgy, and the restless energy of new learning had all done their work. Before he had made any public contribution, before his name carried authority, the foundations had been laid in stone corridors, in family expectation, and in the charged intellectual air of a changing century. By the time Thomas reached young adulthood, the shape of his vocation had begun to press against the expectations of his family. At Naples, he studied the liberal arts and encountered masters who introduced him to logic, natural philosophy, and the difficult, compelling questions that arose wherever faith met disciplined reason. These were not abstract diversions. In the 13th century, education was a deeply serious undertaking, tied to the life of the church, the governance of society, and the salvation of souls. To learn how to argue well was to learn how to distinguish truth from error. To read Aristotle was not merely to acquire classical polish. It was to encounter an intellectual system so powerful that it demanded either integration or rejection. What Thomas wanted in these years seems clearer in hindsight than it would have felt at the time. He wanted not status, though it had been available to him. He wanted not family advantage, though he had been born into a world where that mattered greatly. He appears instead to have desired a life wholly given to God through study and preaching. The Dominicans, with their combination of poverty, mobility, and intellectual seriousness, offered exactly that. Around 1244, he entered the order, and in doing so, he stepped into a conflict that revealed how uncertain and human his early adulthood truly was. For his family, the decision was shocking. Had he aimed at a high ecclesiastical office through an old and wealthy monastery, they might have understood. But to join a mendicant order, to renounce inheritance and social expectation in favour of a life that depended on alms and scholarship, seemed to them almost a theft of family possibility. His brothers were reportedly sent to intercept him as he travelled north. He was seized and brought back, effectively held under family control for many months, perhaps in one of the family strongholds. The story survives in varying forms, and like many medieval accounts, it has gathered a certain legendary texture over time, but the basic conflict is widely accepted. The imprisonment, if that is the right word for noble confinement, was a formative episode. It showed a young man forced to defend an inward conviction against outward pressure, not from strangers, but from those closest to him. Medieval families were powerful moral worlds. Disobedience was not easily romanticized. To resist father, mother, brothers, and dynastic expectation required unusual steadiness. It is said that various means were used to persuade him, including argument, pleading, and perhaps even the attempt to compromise his chastity through temptation. Whether every detail later told is exact or not, the broad pattern remains suggestive. Thomas did not enter his adult life through easy affirmation. He entered through refusal, patience, and the testing of resolve. These months likely deepened the traits later associated with him: calm endurance, restraint in speech, and a mind capable of remaining fixed on first principles amid noise and pressure. He was not a fiery rebel in the mould of later romantic imagination. There is little sign of theatrical defiance. His resistance seems to have been quieter, rooted in conviction rather than temperament. Eventually, his family relented, or at least ceased to prevent what they could not break, and he returned to the Dominican path. From there, he was sent north for further formation, first to Paris and then to Cologne, where he came under the influence of Albert the Great. Albert was one of the largest intellectual figures of the age, a Dominican scholar of astonishing range, whose interests included theology, philosophy, natural science, and the works of Aristotle. To study under such a man placed Thomas in one of the most fertile centres of medieval thought. Paris, in particular, was a place where argument had become almost an art form. Its schools and faculties brought together students and masters from across Europe. In lecture rooms and disputations, questions were framed, objections stated, authorities examined, and conclusions patiently drawn. Thought moved by structure. Thomas did not present himself there as a dazzling personality. He was large in body, reserved in manner, and inclined towards silence. Some fellow students reportedly mistook his quiet for dullness, giving rise to the famous nickname, the dumb ox. The story is almost certainly sharpened by later retelling, but it survives because it expresses something real about the contrast between appearance and depth. Albert is said to have replied that the bellowing of this ox would one day fill the world. Whether those precise words were spoken or not, the anecdote captures the impression Thomas made: not immediate brilliance in display, but immense power held in reserve. What he learned from Albert was not merely content. He learned a method. Albert modelled an expansive confidence that all truth, wherever found, belonged ultimately within the divine order. He approached Aristotle not as a threat to faith, but as a thinker whose works required careful reading, discrimination, and disciplined integration. In this atmosphere, Thomas absorbed the conviction that theology need not fear philosophy, provided reason remained honest about its scope and revelation retained its proper authority. This would become one of the hallmarks of his mature work. His early writings already show the shaping of an original mind. One of the most significant is De Ente et Essentia, or On Being and Essence, composed while he was still relatively young. Even the title reveals the territory that occupied him, not passing controversy alone, but the deepest metaphysical structure of reality. What does it mean for something to be? How are essence and existence related? How do created things differ from God? These are not questions that arise from ambition in the ordinary sense. They arise from a mind drawn to foundations. Yet Thomas's coming of age was not a simple ascent through study. The university world was contentious. Tensions simmered between secular masters and the mendicant orders, whose prominence in teaching provoked jealousy and resistance. The arrival of Aristotle's full corpus, often through complicated chains of translation and commentary, sparked anxiety among theologians who feared philosophical systems that seemed to leave too little room for providence, immortality, or divine freedom. To be a Dominican intellectual in this setting was to live near controversy, even before becoming its direct object. As the years passed, Thomas developed his own voice within this world of teachers and opponents. He lectured on Scripture and on Peter Lombard's Sentences, the standard theological textbook of the age. He learned the exacting format of scholastic disputation, where a question would be posed, objections carefully articulated, authorities cited, a contrary position stated, and then a reasoned answer unfolded point by point. This form, sometimes caricatured later as dry or mechanical, suited his mind perfectly. It allowed complexity to be handled without haste. It gave opposition its due before resolving it. It assumed that truth was not damaged by being questioned. There is something deeply human in this stage of his life. Before he became a towering authority for later generations, he was a young friar learning how to think in public, how to teach, how to answer objections, and how to bear misunderstanding. He was formed by teachers, constrained by institutional demands, and sharpened by conflict. The polished serenity associated with his later reputation was achieved through labour. The university halls of Paris and Cologne were not quiet in spirit, even when quiet in sound. They were arenas of intellectual risk. In those years, Thomas came fully into himself. The son of southern Italian nobility became a friar of the universal church. The student of liturgical discipline became a master of argument. The quiet novice became a teacher whose silence concealed not emptiness, but concentration. What he wanted before the world knew him was not fame. It was a life in which truth could be sought without reserve and offered back to others with order, charity, and force. Thomas's rise to prominence was neither sudden nor inevitable. It emerged from a convergence of opportunity, institutional need, personal discipline, and the unusual breadth of his gifts. By the 1250s, he had become a central figure in the Dominican intellectual project, though that prominence first revealed itself in conflict. The University of Paris, where theological prestige in Latin Christendom reached one of its highest concentrations, was not at peace. Secular masters resented the influence of mendicant orders, especially the Dominicans and Franciscans, whose members often held important teaching posts despite their vows of poverty and obedience to superiors outside the university structure. In this charged environment, Thomas was drawn into debates that were partly administrative, partly ideological, and entirely serious. The question was not only who had the right to teach, but what kind of life best suited the pursuit and communication of truth. Critics of the mendicants viewed them as intruders, protected by papal favour and lacking the rooted civic ties of secular scholars. Defenders of the friars argued that a life of disciplined poverty and apostolic purpose freed them for teaching and preaching in a way that older structures did not. Thomas wrote in defence of the religious orders, including works that justified mendicant life against its opponents. These were not his most famous writings, but they matter because they show him stepping into public intellectual combat with confidence and precision. He became a master of theology at Paris in the mid-1250s, a significant achievement for any scholar, especially one still relatively young. To hold such a chair meant more than enjoying academic honour. It meant occupying a place from which one shaped future theologians, contributed to major debates, and helped define what counted as sound teaching. Paris was not merely a university town. It was, in many respects, one of the minds of Europe. A master there entered a conversation that reached across kingdoms. What distinguished Thomas was the way he handled the expanding philosophical inheritance of the age. Aristotle had become central to university learning, but his integration into Christian thought remained incomplete and deeply contested. Some readers embraced Aristotelian ideas in ways that seemed to diminish divine providence or the soul's immortality. Others recoiled and preferred to limit philosophical speculation in favor of more traditional theological patterns. Thomas pursued another path. He read carefully, accepted what reason could establish, rejected what contradicted revelation or better argument, and built bridges without collapsing distinctions. This intellectual posture gradually marked him as more than a competent teacher. He was becoming an architect of synthesis. During these years, he produced major commentaries and theological works that displayed both command and method. He did not write as a solitary essayist, wandering where inspiration led. He wrote within the demands of teaching, disputation, and religious service. Much of his work arose from lectures or from the formal questions debated in academic settings. Yet from these institutional forms, he fashioned something remarkably enduring. His arguments were clear without being simplistic. He moved from objection to conclusion with patient order. He cited authorities widely, but never treated citation as a substitute for thought. His relation to Albert the Great remained important, but he was no one's mere disciple. Where Albert had shown encyclopedic breadth, Thomas increasingly displayed a distinct metaphysical clarity. He developed a sharper account of being, causality, essence, and existence than many of his contemporaries. He showed unusual confidence in the ability of human reason to know certain truths about the world and even about God, while also preserving the mystery and gratuity of revelation. This balance gave his work a durable stability. Notable relationships also shaped this phase of his life. Within the Dominican Order, he benefited from patrons and superiors who recognized his gifts and assigned him responsibilities accordingly. He collaborated with fellow friars, secretaries, and students in the practical labor of medieval scholarship, which required dictation, copying, revision, and circulation by hand. He also faced intellectual rivals, though not always in direct personal animosity. The broader debates with secular masters, with radical Aristotelians, and with alternative theological positions sharpened his sense of what needed to be said and how carefully it must be said. By the late 1250s and early 1260s, he was moving between important centers of study and teaching, including Paris and various cities in Italy. These relocations reflected both the needs of the order and the growing demand for his presence. He served at the papal court for a time, where theology existed close to ecclesiastical governance and where his learning could be applied beyond the classroom. The papal environment in Italy differed from Parisian academic life, but it too required intellectual labor of the highest level. Questions of doctrine, preaching, scriptural interpretation, and engagement with non-Christian thought all found their place there. It was likely in this period that he began or developed the work known as the Summa contra Gentiles, though its exact circumstances are somewhat debated. Despite the title, it was not simply a polemic against unbelievers. It was a carefully structured exposition of truths about God, creation, providence, and salvation, proceeding as far as possible by reason before turning more fully to revelation. Whether intended primarily for missionary use, for instructing friars, or for another pedagogical purpose, it displayed the mature pattern of his thought. He was not content merely to refute. He wanted to explain. What circumstances made his opportunity possible? In part, the age itself did. The 13th century created openings for a mind like his. Universities had grown strong enough to sustain sophisticated debate. New translations had expanded the available philosophical material. Mendicant orders had committed themselves to advanced study. Ecclesiastical authorities, though cautious, recognized the need for clear intellectual response to new challenges. Thomas entered this changing world at exactly the point where old faith and newly energized reason required reconciliation without confusion. Still, nothing about his success was automatic. He wrote in a culture of dense competition. He had to defend the place of his order. He had to navigate suspicion toward Aristotelian learning. He had to teach constantly and answer formidable objections. He had to think at a level that satisfied both rigorous philosophers and doctrinally vigilant theologians. The path was difficult because the stakes were real. Error in theology was not an academic embarrassment. It could wound souls, unsettle institutions, and draw condemnation. Gradually, however, his reputation widened. Students copied his arguments. Fellow friars sought his judgments. Those who disagreed with him still had to reckon with the force of his reasoning. He became known not for rhetorical flourish, but for reliability of intellect. In a world of intense verbal display, this steadiness itself carried authority. He was a thinker whose conclusions seemed earned. By the time he reached full maturity, Thomas Aquinas had moved from promising friar to one of the leading theologians of his age. Yet, even then, his prominence retained a certain monastic quality. He remained a religious, governed by prayer, obedience, and the ordinary demands of communal life. His greatness did not take the form of political office or popular spectacle. It took the form of pages filled in disciplined sequence, of lectures delivered in halls of study, of questions pursued until their principles became visible. He rose not by asserting himself over others, but by illuminating the structure of things so clearly that others could see farther in his company than alone. The heart of Thomas's life lies in the work itself, in the slow and astonishing labour by which he brought so many fields of thought into coherent relation. It is easy to speak of influence in broad, reverent terms, but the reality was made of very concrete scenes. A friar dictating to multiple secretaries, a master responding to objections in a crowded room, a theologian reading scripture by candlelight, a scholar weighing the claims of Augustine, Aristotle, and the Apostle Paul with equal seriousness. His achievement did not occur in abstraction. It unfolded in classrooms, convents, papal residences, and houses of study, wherever parchment, ink, memory, and disciplined method could be brought together. The work for which he is most famous, the Summa Theologica, began in the 1260s and remained unfinished at his death. It was conceived not as a display of intellectual vanity, but as a structured guide for beginners in theology. That description can seem almost impossible when one confronts its scale and intricacy, yet it reflects something essential about Thomas's purpose. He wanted to teach well. He wanted to present Christian doctrine in ordered form, beginning with God, then creation, then human action, then Christ and the sacraments. The structure itself reveals his confidence that truth possesses order, and that to understand theology properly, one must grasp how its parts belong together. The method of the Summa is as important as its conclusions. Each question is broken into articles. Objections are raised first, often sharply and fairly. A contrary authority is then introduced. Thomas gives his own answer, and finally responds to each objection in turn. This procedure models an intellectual virtue that remains striking. He did not merely state what he thought. He trained the mind to consider why someone might think otherwise. Even when wrong in particular judgments, he dignified the act of disagreement by giving it form. For a sleep-bound listener centuries later, there is something almost architectural in this, a sense of corridors and chambers opening one into another, each built for clarity rather than haste. Among the most widely remembered portions of his work are the so-called 5 ways, found near the beginning of the Summa. These are not, as later summaries sometimes imply, simple slogans meant to compel belief in a few lines. They are brief metaphysical arguments rooted in motion, causality, contingency, gradation, and finality, each aiming to show that the existence of the world points beyond itself to a first principle. Thomas was not trying to replace revelation with logic. He was showing that reason, operating within the created order, can arrive at certain truths about the necessity of a first cause, a first mover, a being whose existence is not borrowed. The brevity of the arguments in the text hides the centuries of philosophical inheritance beneath them. His achievement, however, extends far beyond natural theology. In metaphysics, he developed one of the most influential accounts of being in Western thought. He distinguished essence from existence in created things, arguing that what a thing is and that it is are not identical in finite creatures. Only in God are essence and existence one. This allowed him to preserve both the real goodness of created beings and their radical dependence on the Creator. It gave intellectual shape to a universe in which created things possess their own integrity, while deriving all being from a source beyond themselves. In anthropology and ethics, he presented the human being as a unity of body and soul, resisting any crude split that would treat the body as a mere prison. Drawing on Aristotle, while remaining within Christian doctrine, he described the soul as the form of the body, the principle by which a living human being is what it is. This gave coherence to moral life, since human action could then be understood in relation to natural powers, habits, virtues, ends, and the final good. Happiness, in his account, is not reducible to pleasure or worldly success. It is fulfillment in accord with human nature, ultimately perfected in the vision of God. His treatment of virtue is one of the quiet triumphs of his thought. He gathered the classical cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, together with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. In doing so, he offered a moral vision, neither legalistic nor sentimental. Human beings do not become good merely by obeying isolated rules or by feeling intensely. They become good by being formed, by acquiring stable habits that direct desire, reason, and action toward what is truly good. Grace does not destroy nature in this scheme. It heals and elevates it. That famous phrase, associated with his wider outlook, captures much of his genius. He saw creation not as an embarrassment to be escaped, but as the very field in which redemption unfolds. His account of natural law became one of his most influential contributions to political and legal thought. For Thomas, law is not simply command backed by force. It is an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by one who has care of the community and promulgated. Human law, to be just, must participate in a deeper rational order grounded in eternal law and accessible in part through natural law. This did not mean that every legal question could be solved mechanically by appeal to obvious principles. He knew well the complexity of circumstances, but he insisted that moral and political order are not arbitrary. Human beings, by reason, can grasp certain basic goods and direct social life accordingly. This vision would echo across centuries, influencing canon law, moral theology, legal theory, and modern debates about rights and justice. Though later ages would reinterpret him in ways he could not have foreseen, the enduring force of his natural law teaching lies in its refusal to sever ethics from human nature, or politics from moral intelligibility. His Christology and sacramental theology also shaped the Catholic tradition profoundly. In the Summa and elsewhere, he addressed the Incarnation with careful precision, how Christ can be one person in two natures, divine and human, how grace operates in the human soul of Christ, how redemption is fittingly accomplished. In sacramental theology, he asked how material signs become instruments of divine grace, how baptism, Eucharist, penance, and the other sacraments belong within the life of the Church. Here his style remains characteristically balanced. He was deeply reverent, yet never content with vague piety. He wanted to understand how sacred realities could be spoken of truly without being diminished. The Eucharist held special importance for him. Tradition associates him with liturgical texts composed for the feast of Corpus Christi, including hymns of remarkable beauty and doctrinal depth. Whether heard in chant or read as poetry, They reveal another register of his mind. The man so often remembered as a system builder could also write with lyrical concentration on divine mystery. In him, theology and prayer were not rivals. Thomas also produced extensive biblical commentaries and commentaries on Aristotle. This matters because it shows the breadth of his intellectual service. He was not only inventing arguments of his own, he was reading inherited texts with patience and making them available to students and the church. His commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, for example, helped integrate classical moral reasoning into Christian teaching. His scriptural commentaries remind later readers that he remained first and last a theologian of the sacred page, even while mastering philosophical tools. What is especially striking is the environment in which all this was accomplished. Medieval scholarship was physically demanding. Books were scarce, writing materials costly, and revision cumbersome. Thomas often dictated rapidly to several secretaries at once. Accounts from his contemporaries emphasize both the speed and orderliness of his production. He carried vast textual material in memory. He moved between prayer, teaching, correspondence, disputation, and composition. The image is not of inspiration descending at leisure, but of disciplined abundance. He did not work in comfort detached from controversy. Questions about Aristotle's compatibility with Christianity, the proper scope of reason, the authority of the mendicants, and the interpretation of human nature all pressed around him. Yet he wrote with a calm that itself became a form of influence. He modelled a mind unafraid of complexity because convinced that truth is one. Faith and reason, in his mature vision, cannot genuinely contradict each other, since both come from the same divine source. Reason may err, interpretation may fail, but reality itself remains ordered. This confidence shaped not only his century, but many after it. Later scholasticism, Catholic doctrine, seminary education, natural law theory, and modern philosophical theology all bear his imprint in one way or another. He gave Latin Christendom a vocabulary for discussing cause, act and potency, virtue, law, grace, and beatitude with unusual coherence. He did not settle every question forever. No thinker does. But he established a framework within which countless later questions could be asked more clearly. His achievement, then, was not a single doctrine or a single book. It was the construction of a vast and habitable intellectual world, one in which scripture, philosophy, ethics, politics, nature, and grace could coexist without confusion. He built not a monument to himself, but a way of thinking spacious enough to shelter centuries of argument. No historical figure of real magnitude is made only of harmony, and Thomas was no exception. His life and work contain tensions that emerged both in his own century and in the centuries that followed. Some of these controversies concerned doctrine and method. Others concerned moral and social assumptions that were so woven into medieval life that he often treated them as part of the ordinary structure of the world. To approach these matters fairly is not to diminish him, but to see more fully the conditions in which he thought and the limits that even a great mind can bear. One of the central controversies of his own time was his use of Aristotle. Today this may seem natural, even inevitable, but in the 13th century it carried significant risk. Aristotle's newly available works, often mediated through Arabic commentators such as Averroes and Avicenna, introduced a formidable philosophical framework that did not simply repeat Christian assumptions. Questions about the eternity of the world, the nature of the soul, the operation of providence, and the relation of intellect to individual persons were all implicated in the reception of Aristotelian thought. Some church authorities feared that too much confidence in pagan philosophy would displace revelation or distort doctrine. Thomas believed otherwise. He did not accept every Aristotelian claim, and, in fact, criticized key positions where he judged them false or incompatible with Christian truth. But his willingness to employ Aristotelian concepts in theology made him suspect in some quarters. Critics thought he conceded too much to philosophy. Others thought he had not gone far enough. In trying to mediate between rejection and surrender, he placed himself in the line of fire from both directions. These tensions did not end with his death. In 1277, 3 years after he died, the Bishop of Paris condemned a number of propositions associated with certain currents of Aristotelianism. Some theses, drawn from or linked to Thomas's teaching, were implicated in the broader atmosphere of suspicion, though the exact scope and intention remain historically complex. The event reminds us that his authority was not instant or universally secure. He did not pass from life directly into unchallenged triumph. For a time, aspects of his thought were entangled in ongoing conflict. There were also contradictions in the relation between his intellectual openness and his social conservatism. In philosophy, he could be daringly synthetic, willing to learn from non-Christian sources and to grant reason a robust dignity. Yet in social and political matters, he remained, unsurprisingly, a man of medieval hierarchy. He accepted forms of inequality that later ages would question sharply. He wrote within a world structured by estates, ranks, and assumptions about authority that he did not seek to dismantle. His account of politics is directed toward the common good, but it is not democratic in a modern sense. He values order, law, and rightly directed rule more than participation as later political traditions would define it. His treatment of women reflects another difficulty. Thomas inherited ancient and medieval biological theories that were often inaccurate and that shaped broader cultural assumptions about sex and gender. Some passages in his work, especially those influenced by Aristotelian natural philosophy, have long troubled readers because they appear to subordinate women intellectually or biologically in ways now plainly seen as mistaken and unjust. Yet other parts of his theology affirm the equal dignity of men and women before God, the full humanity of both, and the inclusion of women in the moral and spiritual drama of salvation. The contradiction is real. He could articulate a universal vision of human destiny while still repeating the defective science and embedded hierarchies of his age. His views on non-Christians also require careful attention. Thomas wrote about Jews, Muslims, and heretics in the context of a medieval Christendom that regarded religious unity as a social and spiritual necessity. He sometimes argued for forms of toleration, especially where coercion would be improper or politically unwise. But he also accepted restrictions and punishments that modern sensibilities rightly find severe. His discussion of heresy, for example, can sound stark to modern ears because he treated persistent doctrinal error not only as a private opinion but as a grave social and spiritual danger. This was a common medieval assumption, yet it remains one of the harder aspects of his legacy. There is also the question of slavery and servitude. Thomas did not construct a full defense of slavery in the classical sense, but he accepted the existence of forms of human subordination and dependency without mounting the kind of fundamental critique later moral thought would demand. In this, too, he reflects the limitations of his context. His natural law reasoning contains resources that later thinkers would use towards stronger claims about human dignity and justice, yet he himself did not draw all those conclusions. On a more personal level, there are contradictions between the scale of his intellectual achievement and the relative obscurity of his outward style. He was a man of enormous public consequence who does not appear to have sought visibility in the ordinary human sense. Accounts portray him as absent-minded, contemplative, and at times physically awkward in practical life. He could be immersed so deeply in thought that ordinary social exchange seemed secondary. This reserve may have protected the integrity of his work, but it also contributes to the slightly remote quality of his historical image. He is easier to admire than to imagine in casual company. The warmth present in his liturgical writings, and his treatment of charity is not always evident on the surface of his academic prose. There was also a tension between system and mystery in his work. He pursued clarity relentlessly, dividing questions into distinctions and answers, building ordered explanations of extraordinary range. Yet Christianity contains mysteries that resist full intellectual possession. Thomas himself knew this. He repeatedly acknowledged the limits of reason and the analogical nature of language about God. Still, some later readers have felt that the very power of his method tempts followers into overconfidence, as though theology could become a completed map. In that sense, a contradiction lies not only in him, but in the tradition that grew around him. The master of distinctions could be made into an emblem of certainty beyond what he himself intended. Even his legacy contains irony. He is now often invoked as the great reconciler of faith and reason, yet his writings emerged from bitter controversy and were never free of opposition. He is treated as a symbol of permanence, yet his arguments were forged in response to changes that felt unstable and threatening in his own time. He represents intellectual calm, yet the conditions under which he worked were often contentious and politically fraught. This should not surprise. Some of the most balanced thinkers are formed amid imbalance. What makes these controversies and contradictions meaningful is that they humanize him without reducing him. Thomas was not a timeless voice speaking from nowhere. He was a medieval friar, bound to the assumptions and institutions of his century, moving within limits he did not fully see. He was also a mind capable of extraordinary insight, one whose conceptual tools often outran the immediate uses to which he himself put them. His greatness lies partly in that unfinished quality. He gave later ages not only conclusions, but instruments with which to revise, challenge, and deepen inherited understanding. The final phase of Thomas's life was marked not by retirement into ease, but by continued labour, travel, and teaching. The later 1260s and early 1270s saw him working in Italy, especially in Rome and Naples, while continuing the immense project of the Summa Theologica and other writings. These were productive years, though the productivity must not be imagined as serene leisure. Medieval intellectual work demanded physical endurance. To dictate, teach, preach, pray, and correspond while moving through the obligations of religious life required a body and mind under constant use. Thomas was still comparatively young in years, but the scale of his labour had already been vast. He returned to Paris for a second period of teaching, where the atmosphere had, if anything, grown even more contentious. Debates over Aristotelianism and the interpretation of the human intellect intensified. Thinkers associated with so-called Latin Averroism advanced positions on the unity of intellect and related questions that Thomas found deeply mistaken. He responded with characteristic rigour, defending the individuality of the human soul and the compatibility of sound philosophy with Christian teaching. These controversies show that his final years of active teaching were not quieter in content, even if his personal manner remained composed. Eventually he was called back to Naples, where a Dominican studium had been established, and where he continued teaching. Naples brought him near the southern landscapes of his youth, though he returned now not as a noble child or uncertain novice, but as one of the foremost theologians of Christendom. There is something almost circular in that movement, as though the long roads of study had curved back toward their beginning. Yet the return did not signal completion in the simple sense. He was still at work. The Summa remained unfinished, questions still multiplied, students still needed instruction. Accounts from this final period suggest a man increasingly gathered inward, not detached from duty, but perhaps living with a deepened sense of the inadequacy of words before divine reality. Medieval sources must always be read with care, because memory tends to shape the last days of revered figures into meaningful patterns. Still, one event stands out with unusual consistency in the tradition. On the 6th of December, 1273, after celebrating Mass or during prayer, Thomas underwent an experience so profound that it altered his relation to his writing. When urged afterward to continue the Summa, he is said to have replied that he could write no more because all he had written seemed like straw compared with what had been revealed to him. The line has echoed through centuries because it is at once startling and fitting. Here was a man whose life had been given to disciplined argument, to the patient construction of theological order, suddenly declaring the insufficiency of all such labour before a direct apprehension of divine reality. Yet it should not be read as contempt for thought. Thomas did not repudiate reason at the end. Rather, he encountered more vividly the proportion between reason and the mystery it serves. The great builder of intellectual forms fell silent, not because those forms were false, but because they were surpassed. After this experience, he wrote little or nothing more of major substance. The silence itself became part of his final witness. For a mind so fecund, cessation is always meaningful. It suggests exhaustion, certainly, but also completion of another kind, one that could not be captured in ordinary literary terms. In early 1274, he was summoned to attend the Second Council of Lyons, an important ecclesiastical gathering called in part to address efforts toward reunion with the Greek Church and other major concerns of Latin Christendom. That he was chosen for such a mission reflects the continued esteem in which he was held. His judgment, learning, and authority were not merely academic. They were valued at the highest levels of church life. He set out on the journey north, but he was already unwell, or became so along the Chana Pa. Some accounts say he struck his head against a branch while riding, and never fully recovered. Others emphasize a more general illness. Medieval travel was hard, even for the strong. Roads were rough, accommodations uncertain, and the physical toll significant. Unable to continue, he was taken to the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova. The setting of his final illness carries a certain quiet appropriateness. After years spent in the busy centres of study and debate, he came at last to a monastery, to the ordered hush of a religious house far from the disputations of Paris. There, among monks accustomed to prayer, manual order, and the care of the dying, he spent his final days. Though weak, he is said to have continued to speak about Scripture and the sacraments, retaining the orientation that had governed his life from the beginning. Contemplation joined to teaching. The atmosphere of those last days can only be imagined through fragments, but it is easy to picture the stone corridors, the winter light falling cold through narrow openings, the sound of offices sung in choir, the nearness of sickness, and the slow recognition among those around him that one of the great minds of the age was passing out of it. He had spent a lifetime arranging arguments, clarifying concepts, and articulating doctrine. Now the body that had carried that labour was failing. The decline was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was quieter, a weakening, a stopping, the limits of flesh asserting themselves. He died on the 7th of March 1274 at Fossanova, likely not yet 50 years old. By modern standards, that age can seem strikingly young, though in the 13th century it was not extraordinarily so. Even so, the sense of incompletion is unmistakable. The Summa Theologiae remained unfinished. Debates he had entered would continue without him. Questions he helped frame would outlast the institutions around them. There is a particular stillness to the end of such a life. Thomas had written about the soul, the beatific vision, grace, resurrection, and the final end of human beings. He had considered death not merely as a biographical event, but as a theological passage. In his own last season, the speculative and the personal drew near. The man who had spent so many pages on what it means to know and love God moved beyond argument into what he believed to be the fullness of that encounter. For listeners approaching sleep, this chapter of his life settles into a gentler register. The disputes recede. The noise of the university grows faint. What remains is a friar, worn by study and prayer, carried at last into silence by weakness and winter, leaving behind an unfinished manuscript and a completed vocation. When Thomas died at Fossanova in March of 1274, the news moved through ecclesiastical and academic networks that were slower than those of the modern world, yet still capable of carrying reputation with remarkable reach. He did not die as an obscure monk, known only to his immediate brethren. He died as a theologian of unusual prominence, a Dominican master whose writings were already circulating and whose influence had begun to spread well beyond the rooms in which he taught. His death would have been felt differently in different places. At Fossanova, it was the passing of a guest and holy scholar. Within the Dominican Order, it was the loss of one of its brightest lights. In the schools, it was the silencing of a formidable disputant. In the wider church, it was the departure of a servant whose full significance was still unfolding. The immediate response was shaped by both reverence and unfinished controversy. Those who had known him personally remembered his humility, his concentration, and the strange union in him of immense intellect with gentle manner. Accounts of his sanctity began to gather, as they often did, around respected religious figures. Memories of his prayer, his Eucharistic devotion, and his detachment from worldly ambition circulated alongside recollections of his teaching. The pattern is familiar in medieval remembrance. The scholar becomes visible also as the holy man, and his intellectual life is interpreted through the lens of sanctity. Yet admiration was not the whole story. His works remained objects of debate. The university and ecclesiastical disputes surrounding Aristotelian philosophy had not disappeared at his death. Some regarded his synthesis as one of the great achievements of Christian thought. Others remained uneasy about aspects of his method or conclusions. This tension gives the immediate legacy a more textured shape than later veneration sometimes suggests. Thomas did not instantly become the serene and uncontested authority remembered by later textbooks. His reputation matured through argument. The fate of his unfinished Summa Theologica is itself part of that immediate legacy. Students and fellow friars preserved, copied, and organized his writings. In a manuscript culture, survival required labor. Texts did not move automatically into permanence. They had to be recopied by hand, carried from house to house, taught, quoted, and integrated into institutional memory. The Dominican Order played a central role in this process, ensuring that his work remained available to younger scholars. The very structure of his writings, shaped by teaching, made them especially suited to transmission. They could be used in classrooms, cited in disputations, and mined for answers to recurring questions. His burial at Fossanova added another dimension to his immediate remembrance. Medieval piety often gathered around the tombs of those believed to be holy, and relic culture formed a significant part of Christian devotional life. Thomas's remains, like his writings, would not remain without dispute or movement over time. But, already in the period after his death, the sense grew that this was no ordinary teacher who had been laid to rest. The place of his death became associated with his memory in ways that exceeded simple biography. Among contemporaries, what was mourned was not only the loss of a man, but the interruption of a living intellectual power. A master can leave books behind, but books do not answer fresh objections in the room. They do not revise themselves in response to new questions. Those who had sat under his teaching or depended on his judgment would have felt the difference immediately. An unfinished career always leaves a particular ache. He had not withdrawn from work long before death. He was still, in a sense, in mid-sentence. What was criticized, or at least questioned, belonged mainly to the unresolved tensions already present in the intellectual climate. The condemnations and suspicions that followed in the later 1270s show that parts of the academic world remained wary of certain developments associated with Aristotelianism. and, by extension, with some of Thomas's formulations. This did not erase his influence, but it did prevent his immediate legacy from becoming simple triumph. That complexity is important. Greatness in history often arrives mixed with uncertainty. Over the following decades, however, the balance began to shift more decisively in his favor. His writings proved too powerful, too useful, and too coherent to be ignored. Scholars found in him a guide through difficult questions. Theologians discovered that his precision could protect doctrine as much as it had once seemed to risk it. His Dominican brothers promoted his memory with devotion and seriousness. Testimonies to his holiness accumulated. In 1323, less than 50 years after his death, he was canonized. This was not immediate in the strictest sense, but it stands close enough to the memory of his contemporaries to be understood as part of the first great consolidation of his legacy. The combination of sanctity and intellect in his posthumous image proved especially potent. Medieval Christianity honored saints in many forms: martyrs, virgins, confessors, monks, bishops, kings. Thomas came to embody the sanctified teacher, the scholar whose reason was not a threat to faith, but one of its instruments. This gave later generations a model both reassuring and demanding. Learning could be holy, but only when ordered rightly. In the years soon after his death, then, Thomas Aquinas entered that delicate region between memory and history. Those who had known him began to die. Those who had only his books began to interpret him. His body lay still. His arguments continued to move. Thomas Aquinas left behind no kingdom, no army, no city founded in his name. His material traces were modest compared with rulers and conquerors. What he left instead was an intellectual inheritance of unusual durability, one that passed through seminaries, universities, monasteries, and courts, through manuscript copies and printed editions, through controversies, revivals, and reinterpretations. Few thinkers have so thoroughly shaped the structure of Christian theology, while also affecting philosophy, ethics, law, and political thought far beyond confessional boundaries. His place in history rests partly on the scale of his synthesis. He showed that faith need not shrink from reason, and that reason need not become arrogant in order to be strong. He received the newly recovered riches of Aristotle without surrendering Christian revelation to them. He preserved mystery without abandoning argument. He treated the created world as intelligible, and human beings as creatures whose minds are made not merely to feel devotion, but to seek truth. In an age often imagined as dim or credulous, he stands as proof of medieval intellectual confidence at its highest. For the Catholic tradition in particular, his influence became immense. Popes, councils, theologians, and teachers repeatedly returned to him as a master whose thought offered clarity amid confusion. He was eventually named a Doctor of the Church. Centuries later, especially in periods of doctrinal uncertainty or philosophical fragmentation, his work would be revived again and again as a source of order. Yet even beyond ecclesiastical authority, his arguments continued to travel. Discussions of natural law, virtue ethics, metaphysics, just government, and the relation between grace and nature all bear marks of his presence, whether by adoption, adaptation, or critique. Still, his legacy is not merely institutional. There is also a more personal and enduring impression left by the texture of his mind. He thought slowly enough to be fair. He granted objections their due. He did not confuse noise with insight. He lived in a century of sharp conflict, yet his work remains notable for its composure. Even where later readers reject this or that conclusion, they often continue to admire the seriousness with which he pursued understanding. In a world that often moves too quickly from opinion to certainty, his method still suggests another way: to define a question carefully, to hear the difficulty, to distinguish, to answer without haste. He also leaves behind a paradox that gives his life much of its quiet power. Few writers have composed more systematically about divine things, and yet near the end he fell silent, declaring all he had written to be as straw beside what he had glimpsed. That final gesture does not undo his life's labour, it completes it. It reminds the reader that the greatest theological architecture is still only an approach, a preparation, a discipline of mind for realities that exceed language. He spent his life ordering thought toward God, and at the end acknowledged that God remains greater than every thought. To remember Thomas, then, is not only to remember doctrines, it is to remember a kind of intellectual humility joined to immense confidence, a refusal to choose between reverence and rigour. He belonged wholly to the 13th century, with all its limits and assumptions, yet he also speaks across it. The stone abbeys, disputation halls, and candlelit scriptoria of his world have largely passed away, but the questions he pursued remain strangely near. What is the good? What can reason know? What is a human being? What does law serve? What is the relation between creation and its source? And so he passes from the record of days into something quieter than fame, though not less lasting. His name remains in classrooms, in libraries, in chapels, in arguments still unfinished, and in the patient work of minds trying to think clearly about what is highest and most real. It is enough, perhaps, simply to have followed the outline of his life for a while, to let the stone corridors grow dim, the parchment close, and the long labour of thought rest now in the gathering dark.